You have undoubtedly heard the story of Wyngalf the Bold, who is reputed to have liberated the land of Dis from the scourge of dragons. And like most who have heard the story, you likely have your doubts about its veracity. Did Wyngalf really cross the Sea of Dis on a raft buoyed by the gallbladders of 17 mud trolls? Did he really live for a month inside the belly of a giant beaver? Did he really strangle the beast of Bourgogne with its own entrails? No. Frankly, most of the traditional story of Wyngalf is dead wrong, not to mention oddly preoccupied with the internal organs of mythical creatures. The part about the dragons, however, is true. History of the land of Dis prior to the Old Realm is sketchy and dominated by unverifiable and often fantastic myths, to the extent that the Dissian heroic age is regarded by most educated folk as little more than a stock setting for fairy tales and bedtime stories. Underlying these stories, though, are certain historical facts, and I have done my best to separate these from the fabrications. It should be noted, however, that even in a completely factual account, certain overarching themes often seem to arise unbidden. I can only say that if parts of this narrative seem to smack of moralizing or allegory, that is not my intention. I wish only to tell Wyngalf's story as accurately as possible. At least one fact can be established with some certainty. Wyngalf of Svalbard was a traveling evangelist for a now-defunct religious sect known as the Non-Initarians, which espoused a faith so arbitrary and counterintuitive that those simple-minded enough to see its appeal were generally unable to grasp its doctrinal nuances firmly enough to convert. Wyngalf himself was surprisingly erudite, if somewhat naive, a combination that placed him solidly in the Non-Initarians' targeted demographic. He was also, truth be told, an astonishingly poor advocate for his chosen faith, and this fact was only partially explained by the intrinsic unpalatability of non-Initarianism. Wyngalf's sales pitch was so off-putting that he could have been selling skins of water in the middle of the vast desert, and caravans would have gone miles out of their way to avoid him. The surprising thing about Wyngalf, then, was not that he failed in his effort to establish non-Initarianism in Dis, but rather that he very briefly became an extremely influential religious leader in that land. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Wyngalf was abandoned as an infant on the doorstep of the non-Initarian stronghold in Svalbard, and he spent the next 23 years being indoctrinated in the stultifying nuances of that obscure faith. On his 23rd birthday, he passed the last of the 11 tests of non-Initarian apostleship and was allowed to leave the stronghold for the first time. For the next 5 months, he traveled down the western coast of the Sea of Dis, preaching the gospel of non-Initarianism and gradually becoming aware of the near-complete lack of interest in metaphysics that characterized the denizens of the jagged coast. Wyngalf's story begins in earnest in the town of Skuldred, the southernmost town in Svalbard, and the last in a series of settlements that had been unlucky enough to be subjugated to his droning harangues on the 21 theses of non-Initarianism. The reception to Wyngalf's message in those towns ranged from complete disinterest to outright hostility. He'd actually had to flee from villagers with torches and pitchforks at one point, and Skuldred was his last chance to make a convert before having to return, an unmitigated failure, to the non-Initarian stronghold in Svalbard. The bishop would then undoubtedly strip him of his vestments and sentence him to spend the rest of his life pulling weeds in the vast radish farm that spread out for dozens of acres behind the stronghold. It was with these worries on his mind that Wyngalf set down his pack and hat in the town square of Skuldred, cleared his throat, and began a well-practiced sermon titled 14 Points by which the pagan might be convinced of his errors in thought, word, and deed, and thereby made ready for accepting the irrefutable truth revealed by the fourth person of the non-Initarian faith.